Alrighty, MDI Group A happened this most recent weekend, and honestly, it was probably one of the most enjoyable MDI weekends that I've seen in a long time. It was especially the most enjoyable for cup play in particular, where the competition was high and the teams actually showed off a lot of interesting strategies. And we're going to kind of talk about some of the most interesting stuff that we saw from this most recent weekend and kind of recap it a little bit. So first and foremost, there's been a slight change to the format. The teams have been knocked down from 24 seeded teams to 16 seeded teams, and then the top four from Cup A and Cup B are going to be making it to the global finals. Obviously, as a byproduct of this, the season is shorter, which is unfortunate, but as an advantage of this, the competition is a lot higher, starting a lot earlier, where we have Cup A with Echo, Last Hope, Legendary, Dogs, Direwolves, Date Night, Levels, and Some Seriousness. And these teams were pretty good. All of them were actually quite good. And as for the maps that we saw, I think that Murazan's Rise and Waycrest Manor were highly banned out as the higher key levels go. The key levels range from 22 to 24, and you can kind of see the affixes here. So let's talk about what the results were, and then we'll talk about some of the tech and some of the corresponding conversation that has happened after this most recent Cup weekend. So first and foremost, the results. As a surprise to probably nobody, Echo won the weekend. Now, Echo actually had to overcome some adversity, actually getting knocked down to the lower bracket by Dogs in the upper quarters. And then that set up Dogs versus Last Hope in the upper finals, where Last Hope was able to win that. So it ended up being Echo in first place, Last Hope in second, Dogs in third, and Legendary in fourth. And so, the top four seeded teams were the teams that made it out. I think Dogs was the 8th seed coming into this. I think Last Hope and Legendary were 4 and 5, and then I think Echo was the 1 seed coming into this Cup A weekend. And so they were the expected teams to make it out. But I mean, there was a lot that went down. I thought that Direwolves actually looked quite good. They were very close. And then we also had newcomers with Date Night, Some Seriousness, and they played in the TGP, but they're newcomers to the MDI in Levels. And I'm gonna be straight up. Sometimes whenever you see like the 24 seeded team tournaments for MDI, the competition is a little bit lower, but these lower seeded teams in the 16 seed format were incredibly good. Date Night, Levels, and Some Seriousness, for being like brand new teams to the MDI format, were just absolutely phenomenal. Obviously, Direwolves have gone by a few names over the course of time. Obey Alliance is maybe what you also could potentially remember them as. They're like an Australian team, and they also looked pretty good. But yeah, so basically Dogs, Last Hope, Echo, and Legendary are going to be those teams that are making it out. And like I was saying, there was some adversity. Echo getting knocked down into the lower bracket was a bit surprising. Dogs looked incredibly good at times. I think that the big story for Dogs is that they are very high highs, very low lows. Not the most consistent team we've ever seen, but the strategies that they go for are so high risk, high reward. And if they're able to pull them off, they're likely to kind of win the key. Now, that's not always likely to happen because the strats that they employ in some of these dungeons are very dangerous. And we're going to talk about some of the strats in a little bit and kind of talk about composition, but just know that some of the strats that they employ are very dangerous. So Dogs won that. We also saw a lot of really cool runs. I think we saw some sub 10-minute keys. I would say the average key duration is somewhere between, about the 10-minute mark to the 15-minute mark. Rarely does it go over 15 minutes. Infrequently does it go under 10 minutes. There is a Taldazar, though, that went under 10 minutes a couple of times this most recent weekend. And if you watched back in BFA, you know that Atal is definitely set up to be a 10-minute dungeon. However, there's like a lot of stuff that goes wrong in a 10-minute dungeon. And I mean, look at this first pull from Legendary on the left-hand side of your screen. Just how large they are going. This is literally every single mob, except for that Colossus pack that's to the left. And they're going to pull all of this into Priestess Alunza. That's just an insane pull. All right. Let's talk next about strat stuff, and then we'll talk about comps. So as for strat stuff, I think that the massive pull in Atal'Dazar was like a pretty big deal. I think in general there was some really, really cool stuff in the Everbloom. So you're actually able to tank Gnarl Root in the water and Z-axis the silence. That's like a big deal for live key teams. Now you can't avoid the damage from the roots themselves, so this means that your healer is going to actually have to heal a lot. But being able to Z-axis the silence from Gnarl Root maybe makes it on the tape, maybe brings it into the fray and puts on the table for potential live keys. I don't think that it's like super likely or will be a super common pull, but it's definitely something that could be possible. Now, there's also questions as to like how are you supposed to route around Everbloom, because these TGP teams actually, by and large, went Ancient Protectors first, and then they went Archmage Soul, and then they went Witherbark, and then they gated back up to the Archmage Soul area, and then they went into Yalnu. Is that actually faster? I think that's hard to really tell. But overall, those were probably some of the big strats that we saw this weekend, and capped off with probably the most impressive strat that I've seen in a very long time, involving Rise Rift Mages. So for those who don't know, the Rise Rift Mages, whenever they are killed off, they drop a portal, right? And more often than not, these portals are cringe, right? You accidentally walk over them whenever you're out of combat, and then you get sent back to the beginning, and you're like, what are these for? However, Echo and I think Legendary have figured out a way to use them with a tactic that I would probably call meld juggling and like summon juggling with manipulating combat on mobs. And so basically what happens is Xaylia melds out of combat to be able to hit this portal, because you can't take the portals in combat. Then before he hits the portal, he wraths at a Rift Mage that now is in combat with, that now has gotten to like 0.5% HP. And then he hits the portal, right? And before the Wrath hits, he hits it because you're waiting for the travel time of the Wrath. And so in that period before the travel time combats him, he's able to take it. So now he's in combat, which isn't a huge deal, but it's going to be a problem here in a second. So now is fighting the Rift Mage on the main platform. And so now will then meld, as you see on screen here. Xaylia is going to get aggro of this Rift Mage because of the Wrath that he shot at the Rift Mage. The Rift Mage is going to then port to him, and he's going to staff it to death. It's actually very scary because he might get infinite burned here. He actually does get meleeed even by the mage. So this is not necessarily a strat that works in higher level keys, but it does work in the MDI. And so what you see right here is that a portal has been dropped. And this is really interesting as well, because then the rest of the group of Echo now is still on the main platform. And now is on the main platform with the 4th Rift Mage. And what he's going to do is he's going to drop a Sigil of Flame, and before the Sigil of Flame contacts that Rift Mage, he's going to accept a summon. And he's going to accept a summon into the battlefield room, which is going to unlock interdimensional portaling, right, between Battlefield and Morchi, which allows you to snap a bunch of mobs that you otherwise would not be able to do, and completely cut down on travel time in a way that was unexpected by a lot of people. If you did Algathar Academy and you saw people, dropping Sigil of Flame beneath mobs and then like hitting that wind gust way and then snapping mobs up to that middle platform with that mini boss, it kind of works similar to that with the summon snapping. And so what you're going to see here is Xaylia is also getting summoned, and now we have the tank, this Horde Destroyer being pulled with the Rift Mage. And then once this Rift Mage dies, they're going to be able to take the Farseer mobs with a similar Sigil of Flame hop into the portal technique that we saw to get now to this platform. With a similar technique, they're going to snap the Farseer pack into Morchi. And this, I don't know fundamentally how much time this saves. I think it saves probably somewhere in the order of like 20 to 30 seconds whenever it's done perfectly. But in keys that are, 12 to 15 minutes long, 30 seconds is actually a pretty large time save. And so we saw some memes that were created about this. This interdimensional snapping, portaling thing through Rise was a huge, huge technique, and one that I suspect all Cup B teams are going to be looking to adopt here in the future whenever we see Cup B being played this most recent weekend. Now let's talk about comps that we saw, because comps, I think, were something that was probably the most heavily discussed thing over the entire weekend, aside from probably the Rise portals. I think that those were the top two. First and foremost, standard composition was Resto Druid, Vengeance Demon Hunter, Destro Warlock, Fire Mage, Shadow Priest. Not super surprising by any means. This is basically what we saw during time trials in spades, and so of course we're going to be seeing that in the MDI Cup play as well. Stuff that we didn't necessarily see in time trials, but we're not super surprised to see during Cup play, was Mistweaver Monk and Subtlety Rogue. So let's talk about Mistweaver Monk and Subtlety Rogue. Mistweaver Monk is slightly worse DPS than a Resto Druid on average. especially in like the single target damage department, especially with things like Heart of the Wild being available to the Resto Druid. The Resto Druid's damage is slightly superior. What Mistweaver does, however, is first and foremost, they have passive damage, which, is nice for some aspects of it, but typically Resto Druids are just going to be fully DPSing in an MDI anyways. But the passive damage of the Mistweaver is nice. The big thing about the Mistweaver, though, is that the throughput HPS is much higher than Resto Druids, and this allows some pulls to be done that otherwise would not have been done. Whenever I think of one, I think of like I think of like Last Hope versus Legendary's Dark Heart Thicket, where they were playing a Mistweaver monk and they did this absolutely colossal pull into the first boss that was mostly decided off the back of having a Mistweaver monk. And so, and you can see on the right side of your screen here, this is kind of what the Mistweaver allows, where other teams would be playing a much smaller pull or not taking it into the boss. So that was kind of the deal with the Mistweaver monk. Sub Rogue, and I talked to some of the other Cup B participants, like what the situation where Sub Rogue is good in. It's mostly used for Speed Shroud in dungeons that you can't mount. And so it cuts down on the travel time pretty heavily, just by having access to that Speed Shroud on a pretty low cooldown. Sub is quite good uncapped AoE as well. We were already seeing people playing it in things like Everbloom, just doing the most amount of damage in like the first area of Everbloom. And so Sub was already good, but it's mostly utilized for Speed Shroud in dungeons that you can't mount frequently. Now, the other compositional stuff that we saw a lot of 4 DPS. Actually, not a lot, but we saw a decent amount of 4 DPS cutting a healer. And so these were in dungeons that had a couple of factors. First and foremost, low group damage just in general. So very rarely are you going to be able to play this in keys where group damage on average is pretty high. In addition to that, you can't have something like bursting on the key set. And then third, anything that was like a low key level were candidates to be 4 DPS. And we actually saw this kind of evolve over the course of the weekend, where day one, Dogs was the only team 4 DPS, and they 4 DPS both Everbloom and Atal'Dazar, right? Where they played Vengeance Demon Hunter, Fire Mage, Destro Warlock, Shadow Priest, Augavoker. And they did that both Everbloom and Atal'Dazar, and they did that. That was basically their go-to 4 DPS composition. Then we saw Echo versus Dogs, and this series had 3 maps where 4 DPS were present. Both Echo and Dogs 4 DPS the Atal'Dazar. Echo ends up winning this. And then Dogs 3 DPSs and 1 heals a fall, and is actually faster than Echo whenever Echo is 4 DPSing. Echo's 4 DPS composition is actually having Xaylia play Ret Paladin. And the Ret Paladin did a surprisingly large amount of damage. Xaylia's Ret's kind of a beast. And then that took it to map 3 in the Everbloom, where it was a 4 DPS off in the Everbloom, like we were showing earlier, where that Augavoker versus that Ret Paladin was really showcased. I think it came down to the 1 death and a little bit of Sanguine healing, and Dogs were able to win the series 2-1. But then this kind of opened up, Last Hope and Legendary realized that they kind of needed to start 4 DPSing, and these two teams did not 4 DPS a lot. I think there was only one map that Legendary 4 DPS'd, and I believe it was a fall where Legendary had Tobo play Moonkin as opposed to healer. But now this calls into question how many more maps are going to be 4 DPS'd, and what is this strategy going to be look like for Cup B? Now tweeted that something I noticed in this cup is that 4 DPS is a neat pocket pick and can be sick, but when you run it in half the dungeons because you have a ton of hybrids plus low damage intake, it becomes really meh. Wouldn't mind to lock up a comp. Wouldn't mind to lock a comp to tank healer in 3 DPS. And this is like an MDI rules thing is what he's recommending, that the MDI rules change to this. And then JB also quote tweeted saying, players don't like 4 DPS, only viewers, specifically viewers with bad taste do. Healers like healing, DPS, and tanks like being healed. No one wants to bring a 4th DPS. And then Dorky replies with a snarky comment, my team and I feel safer with an Augavoker over an R-Druid. They never heal. So there's a bit of a discourse as to how the 4 DPS stuff is kind of faring. And the 4 DPS stuff has happened because of a couple reasons. First and foremost, key levels maybe are a little bit low, but at the same point, if you bump the key levels up to 25, 26, it would be very, very challenging for teams to practice these keys. But at the same point, the damage intake this season is really weird, because if you played live keys, you know that a lot of live keys are predicated off of one-shot mechanics, right? Where you only really die in a couple of spots in a dungeon, 200 to 0 one shots. And so this means that typically the healer is optional in like lower level keys, except for these couple of moments where the one shots are going to occur. But in a 23, you're not getting one shot by, you know, whatever, like the explosion of the first boss. You're not getting one shot by Smash Spite's charge. And so then these hybrid DPS, right? Or like, you know, mages and warlocks that don't really take that much damage, have 30 seconds effectively to heal themselves up to full before the next Smash Spite charge goes off. And so then it's not a question of like, oh, do we need a healer? It's more like, can we get ourselves fully topped before the next one-shot check that we actually need to be topped for? Because there's very little ambient damage inside of keys outside of like bursting, for example. And so then this allows and opens up the possibility of 4 DPSing. And then inside of keys that you think it wouldn't be possible, like Fall, because you need a Dispel, we're playing with things like Shadow Priest and Warlock, which have Imp Dispel and Mass Dispel for very specific situations. And so those are some kind of reasons that we're seeing 4 DPS. I kind of expect it to be more used in Cup B after it was so heavily showcased in Cup A. And actually, it didn't even come out that often in Cup A. But the times that it came out, it was the overwhelmingly superior strategy. The only time that 4 DPS lost to a 3 DPS and a healer was actually this fall, where Dogs beat Echo. This is the only time that 4 DPS lost to 3 DPS and a healer. And so it's one of those things that it's obviously a very strong strategy. It's obviously very controversial. Personally, I think also similar to now, it's neat as a pocket pick, but whenever half the dungeons are doing it, it is problematic. Kind of fun to watch, I will admit, but I do understand why it's also problematic, and maybe we should be, the MDI should be, I say we, but not me, obviously, but the MDI should be looking to potentially up the key level going into the future and going into the global finals. All right, that's basically all we saw this weekend with the MDI. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I will see you guys in the next one. Watch the MDI. Watch the MDI. Watch the MDI this weekend. Watch the MDI.